The maps were wrong on purpose. That's the part I've never said out loud. Not to my wife. Not to the people who came around afterward with their clipboards and their soft voices. Not to anyone. I drove that route myself for 11 years. I knew every turn, every grade change, every spot where the asphalt buckled in summer. And when the night came that we needed it to work, it took people somewhere it was never going to bring them back from. I helped print those maps. I folded them. I handed them out at the county fair from a folding table with a banner that said, "Be ready." I told a woman with 2 kids in a minivan that the assembly point was the safest building in the 3 counties. She thanked me. I want you to understand that before I tell you anything else. She thanked me, and I believed it when I said it. My name doesn't matter much anymore, but I'll give you the part of it that does. I was a transportation operations coordinator for the county. That's a long title for a man who mostly made sure the right vehicles were in the right places and that the drivers under me had what they needed. I came up driving a school bus when I was 23, then a transit route. Then I moved into the office because my knees were going, and because my wife Dana wanted me home before dark. I knew buses. I knew the cold logic of a route, how a thing that looks like a line on paper is actually 100 small decisions stacked on top of each other. Where a bus can turn, where it can't. How long the doors take to close. How many people fit when you stop being polite about it. What I want you to picture is an ordinary place, not a city. We had one real town, Renner, maybe 9,000 people, and then a scatter of smaller places out along the river valley. And then nothing but farmland, and the ridge that ran up the east side of everything. The county sat in a low spot. We flooded. Not every year, but often enough that the federal people had given us money once, a long time ago, to build out what they called a mass care and evacuation framework. That's where the route came from. That's where the building came from. The assembly point. A big squat thing out past the edge of Renner, built into the side of the ridge, half bermed with earth so it looked like a bunker, even though they'd painted it a friendly tan and put a community center sign on it. It had a gymnasium, a kitchen, dormitory rooms, generators, a well, and its own septic. It was built to hold the whole town if it ever came to that. I'd been inside it maybe 40 times, toured visiting officials through it. I stood in that gym and imagined it full of cots and felt, God help me, a kind of pride. I should tell you about the part of me that made all this possible, because a man doesn't get to confess and leave out the reason he was the way he was. I am a person who trusts the plan over my own gut. I learned that early. When I was a young driver, I had a near miss on a wet hill. Came down too fast, lost it for half a second, and recovered. My instinct in that half second had been to brake hard. And braking hard was exactly the wrong thing. And it nearly put 30 kids into a guardrail. The plan said pump and steer. I'd panicked and gone with my gut instead, and my gut was a liar. After that, I made a kind of religion out of it. The procedure exists because somebody smarter than you in a calmer moment figured out what to do. Your job in the bad moment is not to be clever. Your job is to execute. That belief kept me employed and promoted for 2 decades. It is also the reason people are dead. There was a second thing, a softer thing, and it's harder to say. My son, Marcus, had moved back home that year. He was 26 and he'd had a stretch of trouble. The kind I won't lay out in detail because it's his and not mine to spend. But he was clean, and he was working again. Driving for us, as a matter of fact, on the smaller routes, the ones I could keep an eye on. Having him back under my roof and on my crew had stitched something in me that had been torn for a while. I'd have done almost anything to keep that feeling. I want you to hold on to that, because there's a version of the story where I do the brave thing early. And the reason I didn't is partly that I had just gotten my son back, and I could not stand the idea of being the man who blew up his own quiet life over a feeling. The night it started wasn't even our worst weather. That's what nobody tells you about disasters. They don't always come dressed as disasters. We'd had 3 days of rain up north in the watershed, and the river was high but not cresting, and the forecast had it leveling off by morning. I was working late, which I did maybe twice a week, because the office got peaceful after 6 and I could actually finish things. Dana had texted me a photo of dinner under foil. Marcus was on a late run, the last shuttle out to the river settlements, dropping off the people who worked second shift at the packing plant. Ordinary. The whole thing was so ordinary. The first anomaly was a phone call I almost didn't take. It came in on the operations line a little after 9, and the screen said it was from the state, from the emergency management office, which was not unusual on a rainy night. They'd call to coordinate, to ask about our readiness posture, that kind of thing. I picked up expecting a checklist. The voice on the other end was a man I didn't know, and he was reading. You could hear it. He had the flatness of a man reading words somebody else wrote. He told me that effective immediately, the evacuation framework for our sector was being elevated to a standby activation, and that I should pre-position assets along the primary route and stand by for a possible full activation order. Standard language. But then he said something that snagged on me. He said the assembly point had already been secured and staffed, and that no further personnel were to be sent to the site until the activation order came through. I asked him what that meant. Secured and staffed. We staffed it, my people. The county opened that building and ran it. There was no version of that building being staffed without me knowing who was in it, because I assigned the drivers and the support crew. He didn't answer the question. He repeated the line about no further personnel, and he asked me to confirm I understood. And I did the thing I always did. I confirmed. I said yes, understood, pre-position, and stood by. I wrote it in the log. 2107, standby activation received. Hold personnel from site pending order. And I sat there for a minute with my hand still on the phone, feeling that snag. And then I let the procedure smooth it over. Somebody at the state knew something I didn't. That was the whole point of having a state. They saw the big picture. My job was to execute. The snag faded. I want to be honest about how easy it was to let it fade. I had every reason to. The radar looked manageable. The river gauges, when I pulled them up, were high but reading steady. Everything on my screens told me this was a precaution. An abundance of caution, the kind of thing that gets stood down by midnight, with nobody ever knowing how close it came to being something. So I did what they told me. I called my on-call drivers and told them to come on stage. I called the garage. I started the slow machinery of getting buses fueled and staged along the route, which is real work, hours of it. And it kept my hands busy and my mind off the snag. Around 10, my night dispatcher came in. Her name was Carol, and she'd worked the desk for 15 years, and she was the calmest human being I ever met, which is a virtue in a dispatcher. And that night became something else. Carol had headphones half on, half off, the way she always did, and she sat down and started pulling up the boards, and she said, "Easy as anything." Oh, they already pulled the site crew. And I said, "What do you mean? They pulled the site crew?" And she said the assembly point staff, the support crew that does intake, and the kitchen folks, they'd been called off around 8, told their shift was covered. She said it like it was a scheduling note, like somebody had swapped a Tuesday for a Wednesday. I said, "Who covered it?" She shrugged, headphones sliding, and said the state must have brought their own people, and went back to her board. That should have been the moment. I see it now with a clarity that's almost unbearable. The The state does not have its own people for a county shelter. There's no roving team of federal cot setters who show up and run your gym. The whole framework existed precisely because they didn't have those people. Because in a real event, the only bodies available are local. If the site crew had been pulled and somebody else had taken over, that somebody was a thing I had no name for. But Carol said it so flatly, and she'd worked there longer than me. And her calm was a kind of permission. If Carol wasn't worried, who was I to be worried about? That's how it works. You outsource your alarm to the person next to you, and the person next to you outsources theirs to you, and everyone stands around being calm at each other while the water rises. I'd like to say I shook it off and dug in. What I actually did was call Marcus, and I'll admit to you it was half about the situation and half just wanting to hear my kid's voice on a strange night. He picked up on the second ring. He was fine, finishing his last drop at the river settlements. Said the rain had picked up out there and the low spot on County Road 9 was starting to sheet over, but nothing he couldn't get through. I told him to button up the run and bring the shuttle back to the garage and stage it so that we were on standby. He said sure, no problem. Then he said something that I've replayed more times than I can count. He said, "Hey, you know the community center? I went by there an hour ago and the lot was full. Like, full. Where'd all those people come from?" I asked him what he meant. He said there were cars in the assembly point lot. A lot of them, more than he'd ever seen there. And the windows were lit up. And there was a man at the entrance in a vest waving traffic in. I asked if he recognized the man. He said no, didn't know him, figured it was state. I told him to head back. He said, "Okay, love you, drive safe yourself," and hung up. And I sat there with a second snag now, a bigger one, because nobody had told me to send anybody to that building, and I hadn't. And the state had specifically told me to hold personnel from the site. And yet the lot was full, and the lights were on, and someone in a vest was waving people in. People were already there. People were arriving, before any activation order, before any public alert, while I sat in my warm office executing a standby and feeling responsible. I tried to call the state office back, the number that had called me. It rang, and then went to a recording that wasn't even a person, just a generic state government voicemail tree. Press 1 for this, press 2 for that. None of the options being, explain why my shelter is filling up with people you told me not to staff. I tried the county emergency manager, a man named Pell, and got his voicemail. I tried the sheriff's non-emergency line, and a dispatcher I didn't recognize picked up and told me, when I asked about activity at the community center, that everything's being handled at the county level, and that I should stay in my lane. That phrase, stay in your lane. From a sheriff's dispatcher to the man who ran the county's vehicles on the night of a standby activation. I should have heard it for what it was, a wall going up. Instead, I heard it as one more person telling me somebody else had this, and I wanted so badly for that to be true. Here is the contradiction I sat with, and I want to lay it out plainly because the whole horror of that night lives in the gap. Every official channel told me a calm story. Standby, precaution, handled, secured and staffed. Stay in your lane, steady gauges, leveling off by morning. And every real thing I could actually see or hear told a different story. A full parking lot before an order. A pulled site crew replaced by people nobody could name. A river that Marcus said was sheeting over a road the gauges said was fine. A man in a vest no one knew waving cars into a building that was supposed to be empty. The official story and the real story had come apart, and I was standing in the gap between them. And I chose the official story, because the official story let me stay where I was, and the real story would have required me to do something I was afraid to do. What I told myself was that I'd wait for the morning. The order would come or it wouldn't. The gauges would tell me. I'd have my buses staged and ready, and when the picture got clear, I'd act on it, like a professional. I even believed there was a kind of discipline in that, a maturity. The amateur panics, the professional waits for data. I sat in my chair and watched my screens and felt, for the last hour of my old life, like I was doing my job well. The rain on the office roof got heavier around 11. Carol turned up the volume on the weather radio, the little NOAA box that lives in every operations center, and we listened to the automated voice grind through the advisories. Flood watch, then a flood warning for the upper watershed, then something I'd never heard the box say before. It read out an evacuation order. Not a watch, not a warning, an order for the river settlements and the low areas of Renner, effective immediately, directing residents to proceed to the designated assembly point via the primary evacuation route. The route I'd built. The building Marcus had just driven past. But I had not been given an activation order. That's the thing. The public alert went out before my standby was ever elevated to an activation. The order to send the whole county to my building came over a weather radio, while my phone sat silent on its dock. The framework, the whole careful framework, said the operations coordinator gets the activation order first, pre-positions the buses, and then the public alert goes out so that when people arrive at pickup points, there are vehicles waiting. That was the entire point of the sequence. Buses first, then people. Somebody had run it backwards. Somebody had pushed the public to the building before the system that was supposed to carry them and care for them was switched on. My buses were staged at the garage with their drivers drinking coffee. The people were already moving. I called my drivers up on the radio and told them to roll, all of them, to their assigned pickup points, that we were going hot whether or not I had the paper to say so. That was the one good instinct I had all night, and I want it on the record because it's about the only thing I did right. I didn't have authorization. I gave the order anyway. The buses rolled. And then I called Pell again, and Pell again, and this time he picked up. His voice was wrong. I'd known Pell for years, a dry, unflappable man. The kind who narrated emergencies like he was reading a grocery list, which is exactly what you want in that job. The man on the phone was breathing too fast. He said, "Don't run your route." Just like that. No hello. Don't run your route. I told him the buses were already rolling. There was a silence. And in the silence I could hear something behind him. Voices, a lot of them. An indoor crowd sound. The particular acoustic of a big hard room full of people. Which is a sound I knew because I'd stood in that gym and clapped and heard the echo come back. He was inside the assembly point. Pell was inside the building. And he said lower now. "Get them anywhere but here. Send them to the high school. Send them anywhere. Just not the assembly point." And I said, "Why, Pell? What is going on?" And he said the thing that I have carried every day since. He said, "Because nobody's getting out of this one." Then the call dropped. Not hung up, dropped, the way calls drop when a tower goes or a building's repeater fails. That abrupt nothing. I called back and it didn't ring at all now. Just a fast, busy, the sound a network makes when it's overwhelmed or when it's been told to stop carrying you. And I sat there with the receiver in my hand and the rain hammering. And Carol's weather box, reading the evacuation order again on its automated loop, sending my whole county to a building the county emergency manager had just begged me, in a breaking voice, to keep them away from. I want to tell you I moved fast. I did move, but the first thing I did, the very first thing, was doubt Pell. That's the disease in me, you see, even then. My instinct was not to act on what he'd said. My instinct was to find the official channel that would confirm or deny it. Because Pell could be wrong. Pell could be panicking. Pell could be inside some isolated bad situation that didn't reflect the whole picture. And if I diverted every bus in the county off the sanctioned route on the strength of one man's frightened voice, and it turned out the building was fine, I would have created chaos, sent hundreds of people into the dark and the rising water toward an unprepared high school. And it would have been my call, my name on it, my judgment over the systems. I actually weighed that. With a man's voice saying nobody's getting out of this one still hanging in the room, I weighed the professional risk of believing him. So I got back on the radio to my drivers, and I didn't give them a clean order. I gave them a coward's order, a hedge. I told them to slow their approach to the assembly point, to hold short, to stage at their pickup points and wait for my word before delivering anyone to the site. I told myself this was prudent. Stage the people, don't deliver them yet. Buy time to get clarity. What it actually did was leave my drivers sitting at street corners and parking lots with their doors open, taking on frightened, soaked families who had heard the weather radio, and come running, loading bus after bus with people I had just decided not to deliver anywhere, with no plan for where they'd go instead. Because I hadn't had the courage to pick a destination, I created a fleet of full buses with nowhere to take them. That was my hedge. That was my middle path between the system and the truth. The radio started filling up with my drivers' voices, and that's when the size of it began to come at me. One driver, a steady older man named Reuben, came on and said his bus was full, and there were more people than he could take, that the pickup point at the Renner Fairgrounds had a crowd of 200-300, way more than the framework ever modeled, and they were all asking him the same thing. Was he going to the community center? Because that's where the radio said to go. Another driver said the same, another. The whole county had heard one message: proceed to the assembly point, and the whole county was converging on a single building, on foot and in cars and crowding around my buses. And the only two people who knew the building was wrong were a man whose phone had just gone dead inside it, and me, sitting in a dry office, hedging. And then there was Marcus. He came on the radio, my own son, and he said, "Dad, I'm at the site. The lot's overflowing onto the road. People are walking in. They've got the doors propped and folks are just going inside." And I keyed the mic and I said, "Marcus, do not go in that building. Hold your position. Do not enter." And he said, "The road behind me's flooding. The low spot on 9 is gone. I can't go back the way I came. The only thing in front of me is the lot." And I said, "Then turn around and go any other way. Go up the Ridge Road, go anywhere. Just don't go inside, and don't let your passengers go inside." And there was a pause, the kind of pause where you can hear a person looking around at a situation. And he said, "Dad, there's a guy in a vest at my door telling me I have to unload here. He's saying it's mandatory. There's 3 of them now." I asked him if they were county, if they were anybody he knew. And he said no. He said they had vests and lanyards, and they looked official, but he didn't recognize a single face. And the lanyards weren't our lanyards, weren't the county's, were some plain laminated thing. And the man at his door wasn't asking anymore, he was telling. And behind the man, the building's lit doorway was full of people shuffling in out of the rain. Hundreds of them, soaked and tired and relieved to have finally reached the safe place. The place I'd told them about at the county fair, from a folding table under a banner that said, "Be ready." And I understood sitting there that I had built a funnel. The route, the maps, the assembly point, 11 years of my careful work. All of it was a funnel that took the whole county and poured it into one building. and someone I could not name and could not reach had positioned themselves at the mouth of that funnel and was making sure everyone went in. The system hadn't failed. That was the thing that started to turn my stomach as I sat there. The system was working perfectly. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was delivering every person in the county to a single sealed point, on schedule, by the most efficient route, with full public compliance. The only thing that had changed was what waited for them at the end. And my son was sitting in a bus at the mouth of it, with a man in an unfamiliar vest telling him to open the doors. And behind him, the only road home was underwater. I told Marcus to lock his doors. That's what came out of me. Not a plan, not a direction. Just lock the doors. Don't let anyone on. Don't let anyone off. And I keyed the mic so hard, my thumb went white. And he said, okay, doing it. And I heard the air brake hiss and the thunk of the front door folding shut over the radio. And then I heard him say, quieter, away from the mic, "Hey, you can't." And then the man's voice muffled. And then Marcus came back on, and his voice had changed. The relief and the joking were gone. He said, "Dad, the guy just put his hand on the glass and told me the bus belongs to the site now. He said all county assets are being absorbed. He used that word, absorbed. I have spent a long time on that word, absorbed. It's not a word a man uses if he's improvising. It's a word from a document. It's the kind of word that gets written months before a thing happens, in a room with a long table, by people who are deciding the shape of an event they intend to manage. All county assets are being absorbed. Vehicles, routes, people, the framework. Me. I'd spent 11 years building a thing I thought belonged to my county, to the woman in the minivan and her 2 kids. And somewhere up the chain, it had quietly stopped belonging to us and started belonging to whatever this was. And tonight was simply the night they switched it on. I told Carol to start calling every number we had, the state duty officer, the regional coordinator, the federal liaison line, all of it, and to write down exactly what each one said and exactly when. I don't know why I cared about the record at that moment, except that the record was the only thing I knew how to fight with. I'm a log man. I keep logs. Carol started dialing, and I went back to Marcus and I tried to think like the route. That was the only way I knew how to think. Forget the building, forget the men in vests. Just look at the geometry. Where could a bus go from that lot? The primary route flooded behind him. The lot itself, jammed. The service road that ran along the back of the building toward the ridge, which I happened to know existed because I'd had a man grade it 3 years ago so a fuel truck could reach the generators. A back way. Narrow, gravel, steep at the top, but it climbed the ridge and over to the old logging roads. And from the logging roads, you could come down miles away on the dry side of the valley. I told Marcus about the service road. I told him it ran off the northeast corner of the lot, past the generator's shed, that there was a gate, but it was a cattle gate with a chain, not a lock he couldn't break with a bus bumper if he had to. I told him to get his passengers down low and to drive over the curb if he needed to, and to take that road up the ridge and not stop for anyone in a vest. And he said, "There's people everywhere, Dad. I can't just drive through." And I said, "You drive slow and you lay on the horn and you do not stop. Because if you stop, they take the bus. And if they take the bus, they take everyone on it. And the only thing keeping the 40 people behind you out of that building is you not stopping." And there was silence. And then he said, "Okay. Just okay, my boy." I heard the engine come up. I heard the horn, long and steady. I heard people, distant through the mic. The sound of a crowd being parted by a slow-moving 15-ton vehicle. Shouts, the bus groaning as it climbed the curb. And I heard one of the men in vests, very close to the mic for a second, Say something I'll never be sure of, but that sounded like, "You're on the manifest." And then the radio filled with the rattle of gravel and Marcus breathing through his teeth, narrating to himself the way drivers do, "Easy, easy. Watch the right side, easy." And I sat there in my dry chair 100 miles inside myself, praying to a God I'd stopped talking to. And for 90 seconds, I had my son's voice and the sound of an engine climbing away from that place, and it was the best 90 seconds I've ever had and ever will have. While that was happening, Carol was getting her answers, and her answers were the reveal, though it didn't arrive like a reveal. It arrived like paperwork, which is how the worst things always arrive. She put her hand over her headset and turned to me with a face I'd never seen on her in 15 years. And she said the regional coordinator's line had a recorded message on it. And the message said that the assembly point was operating under a sheltering-in-place containment protocol, and that the route had been designated a one-way corridor for the duration of the event. One way. The route was one way. There was no plan to bring anyone back out. There had never been a plan to bring anyone back out. The framework I'd built and toured officials through and felt proud of had a second half I'd never seen, a half written by someone else. And in that half, the buses went in, and the people went in, and the doors that I'd watched them install, those good heavy doors rated for storms, were not there to keep the weather out. They were rated to keep what was inside. And then I understood the pulled site crew. I understood why they'd called my people off at 8, before any of this, before the public alert, before the order. You don't pull the crew because somebody else is covering. You pull the crew because you don't want county employees, my people, people with families and consciences and radios, inside the building when you seal it. You pull them out so that everyone who goes in afterward is a person you've decided can go in. The men in vests weren't covering my crew's shift. They were the replacement that exists, so there's no one inside who would refuse. I'd thought the snag earlier, secured and staffed, was a bureaucratic sloppiness. It was the opposite. It was the most careful thing in the whole operation. Every piece I'd waved off as confusion had been precision. The calm voices, the stay in your lane, the steady gauges that Marcus's flooding road said were lies. All of it was the smooth working of a plan that needed me calm and obedient and in my chair for exactly as long as it took to fill the building. I'm going to tell you the thing now that I have never told anyone. And I need you to understand the state I was in when I did it, not to excuse it, because there is no excuse, but so you know it was a decision and not an accident. Because the difference matters. An accident you can forgive yourself for. A decision you carry. The weather box was still reading the evacuation order on its loop. Proceed to the designated assembly point via the primary evacuation route. Every minute I read it, more people heard it. And more people moved toward the building, and the buses I had hedged and held at their pickup points were sitting there with their doors open, taking on more passengers to deliver to a place I now knew was a one-way door. I had it in my power to stop that. Not all of it. But I could get on the all-call to my drivers and tell them the truth. Stop, turn around. The building is a trap. Do not deliver anyone. Scatter. Take your people up the ridge roads like Marcus. Take them anywhere. Abandon the route. The route is the kill. I could have keyed that mic and said it plain to every driver in the county. And most of them would have believed me, because I was the man who built the route, and if the man who built the route says abandon it, you abandon it. And I did not do it. I want to walk you through exactly why, because the why is the whole of me. The first reason is the disease I told you about. Even then, even knowing what Carol had read me, there was a voice in me saying, "You don't have it confirmed. A recording isn't an order. Pell could have been describing one bad room and not the whole building. What if you scatter 300 people into floodwater, in the dark, on the strength of a voicemail? And they drown in ditches. And it turns out the building was the safe place after all. That voice had run my whole life. It has kept me employed. And it spoke up right on schedule, calm and reasonable. And it said, wait for confirmation. Don't act on your gut is a liar. Remember the wet hill. The procedure exists because somebody calmer than you figured out the right thing. And the procedure, the actual official procedure, said proceed to the assembly point. So the official procedure and my own 40 years of discipline were both telling me to keep my mouth shut and let it happen. But that's not the real reason. I'll give you the real reason. The real reason is that the only bus I'd told the truth to was Marcus's. The moment I got on the all-call and announced that the assembly point was a death trap, and the men in vests were taking buses and people, the men in vests would hear it. They had radios. They were inside my system. They were absorbing my assets. Of course, they were on my frequencies. And Marcus was on the service road, climbing the ridge slowly, with a cattle gate ahead of him and gravel under him, and 40 people aboard. If I broadcast the truth to the whole county, I'd be broadcasting it to the men who'd just watched my son drive away from them. I'd be telling them which bus mattered. I'd be painting a target on the one vehicle in the county that I would trade every other one to save. So I made the trade. I told myself I'd wait until Marcus was over the ridge and out of range, and then I'd warn everyone. I told myself it was minutes. I told myself the geometry, that the buses at the far pickup points hadn't even reached the route yet, that I had time, that I'd lose nothing by waiting a few minutes to protect my son, and then I'd save the rest. That's the lie I built in the space of about 30 seconds. The way you build a wall fast when the water's coming. And I lived inside it. I kept the mic dead. I let Carol keep dialing numbers that gave us recordings. And I sat there listening to my son's engine on the ridge. And I let the rest of the county keep walking into the building, because warning them might cost me him. I have done the math since. I have done it more times than is good for a person. In the minutes I waited, 2 more of my buses delivered their passengers to the lot. Reuben's bus, the steady older man, full of 2/3 children because he'd loaded the fairgrounds crowd and put the families on first like the good man he was. I heard him on the radio afterward, before his radio went dead, saying, "We're here, we're unloading. The vest fellas are directing everybody inside. Awfully crowded, but they say there's room. Awfully crowded, but they say there's room." That's the last thing I ever heard Reuben say. And I had the truth in my hand, and I sat on it because of the boy on the ridge. Marcus made the gate. I heard it. The impact, the chain snapping, the bus lurching through, him whooping once, a single startled laugh, the laugh of a kid who can't believe a plan worked. He came on the mic and said, "I'm through. I'm on the logging road, Dad, And then his signal started to break up the way it does when the ridge gets between a radio and its tower. His words coming in chunks. "Everybody's okay back here. There's a..." And then a long stretch of static. And then one more fragment, clear as a bell for 1 second, in the way that radio sometimes hands you a clear second like a cruelty. His voice saying, "Love you, tell Mom." And then nothing. Out of range. Over the ridge. Gone into the dry side of the valley with 40 people and my whole heart aboard a bus. And there it was. He was safe. The reason I'd kept the mic dead was safe. Which meant the wall I'd built, the lie that I was only waiting for, came down. And there was nothing behind it but the thing I'd actually done, which was choose. I had what I wanted. Now I had to do the other thing. The thing I'd promised myself I'd do once he was clear. And I keyed the mic to warn the county. Finally, late. And I want you to know I did key it. My thumb went down on that button, and I started to say it. I said, all units, this is operations. Do not, repeat, do not deliver. And the radio was dead. Not the building's repeater, mine. The whole county system. The board in front of Carol had gone dark, every channel, the way it goes when the master goes down. And when I looked up, the lights in the office stuttered, and the screens blinked, and the generator out back kicked on with its low cough, which meant the grid had dropped. But the radio shouldn't have dropped with the grid. The radio had its own power. And the only way the radio drops with its own power is if someone goes to the equipment and turns it off. Someone had gone to my communications equipment and turned it off at exactly the moment the funnel was full and the last asset of value, my son's bus, was over the hill. They didn't need my radio anymore. They didn't need me to be calm in my chair anymore. The job the system needed me for was finished. And they switched me off the way you switch off a tool you're done with, and I sat there, with my thumb on a dead mic, mid-sentence, having waited exactly 30 seconds too long for the only thing that ever could have mattered. And the warning I'd saved for the right moment died in my throat, with no wire left to carry it. I want to tell you about the next part carefully, because this is where most men would put themselves in a car and drive to the building and do something brave. And I did get in a car, and I did drive toward the building. But I need you to know I did it after the radio was dead. After it could no longer cost me Marcus, after the only person my courage could possibly help was strangers I'd already failed. The brave drive came when it was free. That's the kind of brave I am. The expensive courage I sat on. The free courage I spent loudly. Keep that in mind. I took my own truck. The grid was down across Renner now. The town gone black except for the few places with generators. And the rain had turned to that hard, straight-down kind that makes the wipers useless. The streets were filling. Not flooding like the river settlements. But the storm drains were backing up, and the low intersections had sheets across them. And there were people on foot, families, walking in the dark and the wet toward the assembly point because the radio had told them to before the grid died. Walking the route I'd built, holding kids, holding garbage bags of belongings. And they waved at my truck because they thought help was coming, and I drove past them. I drove past them because if I stopped, I'd have to tell them. And if I told them, they'd ask me where to go instead, and I didn't have an answer. I'd never picked the answer. I'd hedged that too. And I could not bear to be the man who stopped a family in the rain to tell them the safe place wasn't safe, and then have nowhere to send them. So I drove past. The high school. I should have shouted high school out the window. It was 3 words. I didn't. I came up on the assembly point from the front, and I stopped a 1/4 mile out because the road was solid cars, abandoned, doors open, people streaming up between them toward the lit building, hundreds of them in the rain. And the building itself was every window blazing, and the doors propped in a slow river of human beings flowing in through those good, heavy storm doors. And standing along the flow, every 20 feet. Men in vests with flashlights, directing, channeling, keeping it moving, keeping it from clotting. Professionals, calm, doing the job I'd been doing all night in my chair, which was keeping the funnel flowing. And I sat in my truck in the rain, and I watched my county walk into the building. And I did not get out. I'll tell you why I didn't get out. And it's the same disease wearing its last mask. I told myself there was nothing one man could do against that. That if I got out and started shouting, they'd simply take me too, absorb me. And then I'd be inside, and Dana would have no one. And Marcus over the ridge would come back to an empty house. And that surviving to tell it was worth more than dying to stop a thing I couldn't stop. Every word of that was true. That's what makes it unbearable. Every word of it was true. And it was also exactly the thing I'd been telling myself all night, all my life. The reasonable voice that always concluded that the right thing to do was the thing that kept me safe. I'd built my whole self out of reasonable conclusions that happened to keep me safe. And I sat in that truck and reached the most reasonable conclusion of my life, which was to turn around, and I turned around. But before I turned around, I saw something. And I have to tell it even though I don't understand it, and I've never tried to make it make sense, because the part of me that wants it to make sense is the same part that got everyone killed. There was a window on the gym side, high up, lit, and behind it, I could see the shapes of people, a lot of people, the way you'd expect a packed gym to look. And they were standing close together, facing the same way, all of them, like a crowd watching something at the front of the room. And they weren't moving. Not the small, constant motion a crowd makes. They stood the way a photograph stands. And then, all at once, every one of them turned their heads toward the window. Toward me, not fast, together. The whole packed room turning to look out at one man in a truck in the rain, in unison, like a single thing wearing hundreds of faces. And the men in vests along the walkway did not turn, didn't react, kept channeling the new arrivals in, because to them, this was normal. This was the protocol working. This was what the building was supposed to do to the people who went inside it. I don't know what I saw. I want to say that plainly. I am not going to tell you it was monsters, because I don't know that it was. And the men who pulled my crew at 8 o'clock and wrote absorbed into a document and made a one-way corridor out of my route. Those men were not monsters either. They were calm people doing paperwork. And that's worse. And I think whatever the building did to the people inside was just the far end of the same calm. Something had been put in that building, or the building had been built around something. And the framework, my framework, was the delivery mechanism, and the flood was the excuse, and the official voices were the throttle that kept the flow steady. And I was a valve. That's all I ever was. A valve in a system. And the system told the valve it was a man with judgment, so the valve would stay calm and keep the flow steady and not slam shut at the wrong moment. And when the valve was no longer needed, they shut off its power and let it go home. I turned the truck around in a flooded intersection, and I drove out of Renner the back way, up the Ridge Road, the way I'd sent Marcus. And the higher I climbed, the more the radio in my truck, the regular FM radio, came back. And there was a man's voice on the emergency band, calm, reading. He said the assembly point operation was proceeding smoothly. He said the framework had performed as designed. He said preliminary indications were that the corridor had achieved full compliance and that residents in the affected sector should remain at the assembly point until further notice. Performed as designed. Full compliance. I had to pull over and open the door and be sick into the gravel. And then I drove on, up over the ridge and down the dry side, toward where Marcus had gone, because he was the only thing left that the night hadn't taken. And I needed to put my eyes on him. I found his bus at dawn in the lot of a closed feed store on the dry side, 20 miles out, the passengers gone, scattered to wherever 40 soaked and silent people go when a bus stops and the doors open and nobody tells them anything. Marcus was sitting on the bottom step in the open doorway with his elbows on his knees. And when he saw my truck, he stood up, and he was alive and whole. And I want to tell you, that was the moment the night turned. That I got my son, and it was enough. But I'm not going to lie to you now, at the end, after lying my way through the whole thing while it mattered. He looked at me, and the first thing he said was, "Did they get out? The other buses, Reuben, did everybody get out?" Because he'd been on the radio, He'd heard Reuben say awful crowded, but they say there's room. And he didn't know yet. And he was asking his father, the man who built the road, the man who ran the operation, the man who would obviously have done everything in his power. Did everybody get out? And I told him yes. That's the choice. That's the one I made last, and the one I've kept longest. He asked me, did everybody get out? And I looked at my living son in the dawn, and I said yes, they made it. They're at the high school. It got crowded, but it held. Everybody's okay. I told him the official story, the calm story, the one that lets a man stay where he is. Because the truth was that I'd had the warning in my hand and sat on it to protect him. That I'd kept the mic dead so the men in vests wouldn't know which bus to chase. That the price of his 40 people was Reuben's bus full of children and the woman from the county fair and her 2 kids and a whole county walking into a building in the rain while I watched from a dry truck and turned around. The price of saving him was the rest of them. And saving him required me to keep quiet at the exact moment that quiet was murder. And I had done it on purpose. And if I told him that, he would know that he was alive because his father chose him over a busload of children. And he would have to carry that, and I could not put that on him. So I put it on myself. I lied to my son so that he could keep loving me. And I have lied to him every day since, every time he mentions that night, and says, thank God you got me out. Thank God you knew about the service road. You saved all those people on my bus, Dad. 40 people. He thinks I saved them. He doesn't know what they cost. The investigations, when they came, were not really investigations. You already know that. A storm, a tragic flood, a sheltering operation overwhelmed by water. A community center where so many sought refuge, and where, the report said, the rising water and the failure of the local operations coordinator to execute the evacuation framework in proper sequence had contributed to a loss of life that was, and I'm quoting the language because the language is the whole point, consistent with the severity of the event. Consistent with the severity of the event. They didn't even scapegoat me hard. They mentioned a failure of proper sequence. My failure, the buses before people sequence that they themselves had run backwards, and they hung it lightly around my neck. And then they let me retire quietly with my pension intact. And I understood the deal in that. The same deal Pell must have been offered before they put him inside. The same deal in the recording, the same calm. Stay in your lane. We kept your name out of the worst of it. You go home now. You're done. You performed as designed. Pell never came out. They listed him among the lost. They listed Reuben. They listed 200 and some others. And the list was not complete, and was never going to be complete, because complete would have raised the question of how that many people came to be in one building before any order was given. And that question had an answer. And the answer was a one-way corridor, written by people with a long table. And that answer was not consistent with the severity of any event. The woman from the county fair was on the list. I looked. Her 2 kids were on the list. I look at the list some nights the way other men look at the inside of their eyelids, which is to say I don't choose to. It's just there when the lights go out. I kept the logs. That's the one thing I did that I'd do again. I have the original log, the real one, 2107, standby received, hold personnel from site, and Carol's notes of every number she called and every recording she got, the one-way corridor, the containment protocol, all of it in her steady hand. And I have it in a fireproof box, and Carol has a copy, and a lawyer I trust has a copy in a sealed envelope to be opened if certain things happen to me. I tell myself that's resistance. I tell myself I'm holding the proof. But I've never sent it anywhere, never given it to a reporter, never stood up in any room and said what I saw, turn its hundreds of heads toward my truck, because sending it would mean the same thing the warning would have meant that night. It would mean acting on my gut over the smooth, official quiet. And it would cost me what I have left, which is Dana and a son who thinks I'm a hero and a quiet house on the dry side of the valley. I have organized my whole self again around the reasonable conclusion that keeps me safe. The box is just a wet hill all over again. I know what the right thing is. I keep deciding I'll do it later, when the moment's right. And the moment is never right. And the box stays in its drawer. And I'm exactly the man I was at 2107, executing a standby, feeling responsible, sitting in my dry chair while it happens to other people. Marcus got married last year. He drives still, a long-haul thing now, good money, and he's happy. And at the reception, he stood up and thanked me in front of everyone. Said his old man taught him that when it counts, you don't freeze. You find the back road, and you don't stop for anyone. You get your people out. The whole room applauded. Dana cried. I sat there with a glass in my hand, and I smiled, and I let them think it. Because that's the lie I've decided to keep. The one with the lowest cost to the people I have left. The same calculation I make every time. And I'm very good at it now. I've had years of practice. I can do it without my face changing at all. I survived. I want you to sit with what that word costs. I am the only person in this whole account who got everything he wanted. I kept my son. I kept my wife. I kept my pension and my house and my name. The men with the long table got their event, performed as designed, and they let me keep all of it as the price of my quiet. And I paid it. I'm still paying it. Every morning when I wake up dry and warm and breathing in a county that has a new community center now. Repainted, rededicated, with a folding table out front at the fair where some other coordinator hands out maps of the evacuation route. The same route, my route, the one that goes one way. I drove past that table this spring. There was a woman with 2 kids stopping to take a map. I slowed down. I had the window. I had 3 words, high school, anywhere, run. I had the whole truth of it in a fireproof box 20 minutes away. I kept driving. I always keep driving. That's the thing the night taught me about myself that I can't put back in the box. The one true finding consistent with the severity of the event. That I'm a man who, when it counts, will choose the version of the story that lets him stay in his chair. And that I will keep choosing it. And that this is not something that happened to me one night in the rain. It's just what I am. And the building only switched it on. I'm still flowing. I'm a good valve. I keep the line moving, and I stay calm, and I go home at the end of my shift. And the worst part, the part I'd cut out of myself if I knew how, is that even now, telling you all of it, finally, after all these years, I haven't told you my name. I've kept it out of the worst of it. Old habit. Stay in your lane. You go home now. You're done.